Have you ever noticed how some people seem to live in a constant state of compromise, bending to every demand, saying yes when their soul screams no, until one day something fundamental shifts inside them? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, observed a profound phenomenon. There comes a moment in certain individuals' lives when they finally say enough and actually mean it. Not the hollow protest of temporary frustration, but a declaration that emerges from the deepest layers of their being, forever altering the trajectory of their existence. This isn't merely about setting boundaries or standing up for yourself. This is about something far more profound, something Jung would recognize as a pivotal moment in what he called the individuation process. It's the day when your authentic self, long buried beneath layers of conditioning and people-pleasing, finally breaks through the surface like a seedling that has gathered enough strength to crack concrete. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal the 7 unmistakable signs that indicate you're approaching this transformative moment, the psychological forces that have been building within you, and why this single word, enough, carries the power to reshape your entire reality. You'll discover how your shadow has been preparing for this moment, how your unconscious has been sending you signals, and why some people experience this awakening while others remain trapped in patterns of endless accommodation. Most importantly, you'll understand what happens in your psyche the moment you cross this threshold and how it connects to Jung's deeper insights about human transformation. The first sign reveals itself through what Jung called psychic inflation, but in reverse. Instead of the ego expanding beyond its boundaries, you begin to experience what we might call authentic deflation. Picture this. You're sitting in yet another meeting where your ideas are dismissed, or you're listening to someone criticize you for something you didn't do, and suddenly there's a strange calm that descends. It's not resignation. It's recognition. Your psyche is no longer willing to expand energy, defending a position that compromises your core being. Jung understood that the psyche has an inherent wisdom, a self-regulating mechanism that eventually refuses to participate in its own diminishment. This moment of calm recognition is your unconscious mind preparing for revolution. The consequence is profound. Your energy, previously scattered across countless meaningless battles, begins to consolidate. You're gathering your forces for something significant. The second sign emerges through the phenomenon Jung described as the withdrawal of projections. For years, you may have seen others as more important, more deserving, more capable than yourself. These weren't conscious thoughts, but unconscious projections where you attributed power and value to external figures while diminishing your own worth. But now, something shifts. The boss who once seemed so intimidating suddenly appears ordinary. The friend whose approval you desperately sought reveals themselves as just another human struggling with their own insecurities. Jung called this the retrieval of projected authority, and it's one of the most liberating experiences in human psychology. You begin to see people as they actually are, not as the inflated figures your unconscious mind created. This shift happens because your psyche is preparing to reclaim the power you've been unconsciously giving away. The psychological consequence is staggering. You stop looking for permission to exist as yourself. The third sign manifests as what Jung termed enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite. You've been the accommodating one, the easygoing person, the one who never causes trouble. But your shadow, that part of your personality you've been suppressing, begins to surface. However, this isn't the crude emergence of repressed aggression. It's far more sophisticated. Your shadow appears as discernment, as the ability to say no without guilt, as the capacity to prioritize your well-being without apology. Jung understood that the shadow, when integrated consciously, becomes a source of tremendous strength rather than destructive force. The person who has never been able to disappoint others suddenly finds the courage to disappoint them in service of their authentic truth. This is your psyche achieving balance, integrating the parts of yourself you've kept hidden. The spiritual consequence is profound. You begin to embody wholeness rather than performing goodness. The fourth sign reveals itself through a shift in your relationship with time. Jung observed that people living authentically experience time differently than those trapped in patterns of compliance. When you're constantly adapting to others' expectations, time feels scarce, rushed, always belonging to someone else's agenda. But as you approach your enough moment, something changes. You begin to experience what Jung called kairos, as opposed to chronos. Qualitative time rather than quantitative time. You start making decisions based on what feels right rather than what seems urgent. You notice yourself saying things like, "I need to think about that," instead of immediately agreeing to requests. This isn't procrastination, it's wisdom. Your psyche is learning to honor its own rhythm, to consult with deeper layers of knowing before responding. The consequence is revolutionary. Your life begins to reflect your actual values rather than your perceived obligations. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because if you're recognizing these signs in yourself, if you're feeling that deep stirring in your psyche that Jung described as the call to individuation, then you're witnessing something profound. This isn't just personal growth we're discussing, it's psychological transformation at the deepest level. If this resonates with you, if you're beginning to understand that your enough moment might be approaching, I encourage you to engage with this community of individuals who are also walking this path of authentic self-discovery. The fifth sign appears through what Jung called the activation of the transcendent function. This is your psyche's ability to bridge the gap between your conscious desires and your unconscious wisdom. You start receiving what feel like downloads of clarity about situations that previously confused you. That relationship that drained you for years suddenly reveals its true nature. The job that seemed secure but left you feeling empty begins to feel like a prison. The family dynamic that you've navigated carefully to keep peace starts to feel like a betrayal of your soul. Jung understood that the psyche, when ready for transformation, provides unmistakable guidance. These insights don't come as harsh judgments, but as gentle, persistent knowings. Your unconscious mind is preparing you for the changes that must come. The consequence is both liberating and terrifying. You can no longer pretend not to know what you know. The sixth sign manifests through a phenomenon Jung described as the emergence of the authentic personality. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about allowing someone who has always existed within you to finally be seen. You might notice yourself speaking more directly, caring less about how your words are received and more about whether they're true. You find yourself drawn to activities, people, and experiences that nourish something deep within you, even if they don't make sense to others. Your sense of humor might change, becoming more honest, sometimes more cutting. Your tolerance for small talk diminishes while your hunger for meaningful conversation grows. Jung saw this as the ego beginning to align with the self, that deeper, more authentic center of your being. The psychological consequence is profound. You begin to feel at home in your own skin for perhaps the first time in your adult life. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The seventh sign is the most crucial and often the most overlooked. It's the emergence of what he called active imagination in daily life. You begin to envision a different way of being, not just in grand terms, but in specific concrete situations. You can see yourself saying no to that request without feeling guilty. You can imagine walking away from that conversation without explaining yourself. You can picture yourself making choices based on your inner guidance rather than external pressure. This isn't daydreaming, It's your psyche creating a blueprint for transformation. Jung believed that imagination was the bridge between the unconscious and conscious mind, and when it activates in this way, change becomes inevitable. The spiritual consequence is remarkable. You begin to live from possibility rather than conditioning. Now we arrive at the moment itself, the day you finally say, enough, and mean it. Jung understood this as what he called a transcendent moment, when the ego's defensive structures collapse and the self emerges. But here's what most people don't understand about this moment. It rarely happens in a dramatic confrontation. More often, it occurs in quiet recognition. You're asked to do something that violates your integrity, and instead of the familiar internal struggle between what you want to do and what you think you should do, there's simply clarity. The word no emerges not from anger or rebellion, but from alignment. Your psyche has finally reached critical mass. The energy you've been using to maintain false accommodations redirects toward authentic expression. Jung observed that this moment often triggers what he called the dark night of the soul, not because saying enough is wrong, but because it dismantles your familiar identity. The people around you might react with surprise, confusion, even hostility. They were comfortable with the version of you that prioritized their needs over your own. Some relationships will evolve to accommodate your authenticity. Others will fall away. Jung saw this as necessary pruning, the psyche's way of clearing space for connections that can honor who you're becoming. What happens in your unconscious during this transformation is remarkable. Jung described it as the integration of the shadow, not the dark, destructive shadow that most people fear, but the golden shadow, those aspects of yourself that you've kept hidden because they didn't fit others' expectations of who you should be. Your capacity for leadership emerges, your artistic gifts surface, your ability to see through deception sharpens. Your tolerance for authenticity in others increases while your patience for performance decreases. The psychological consequence extends far beyond the immediate situation where you first say, enough. Your entire relationship with authority shifts. You stop looking for external validation because you've developed internal approval. You begin to trust your instincts because you've learned to distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of wisdom. Your decision-making process transforms from "what will others think" to "what does my deeper wisdom say?" Jung understood that this transformation has ripple effects that extend beyond the individual. When you stop participating in patterns of accommodation that compromise your integrity, you give others permission to do the same. Your refusal to enable dysfunction creates space for health. Your commitment to authenticity challenges others to examine their own patterns of compromise. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about individuation having collective significance. As you become more authentically yourself, you contribute to the collective awakening of humanity. The spiritual dimension of this transformation cannot be overlooked. Jung observed that saying enough from a place of authentic alignment connects you to what he called the religious function of the psyche. Not religion in the conventional sense, but a connection to something greater than your conditioned self. You begin to experience synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to support your new direction. Opportunities appear that align with your authentic values. People enter your life who can see and appreciate who you really are. But perhaps the most profound consequence is how this moment affects your relationship with yourself. Jung believed that most psychological suffering comes from the split between who we are and who we think we should be. The day you say enough and mean it, this split begins to heal. You start to experience what Jung called the union of opposites within yourself. Your strength and your tenderness can coexist. Your ambition and your compassion find balance. Your independence and your capacity for intimacy complement rather than compete with each other. This integration doesn't happen overnight. Jung understood individuation as a lifelong process, but the day you say enough marks a crucial turning point. It's the moment when your ego stops fighting against your authentic nature and begins to serve it instead. Your willpower aligns with your soul's purpose rather than working against it. Your energy flows toward creation rather than compensation. The ripple effects continue to expand. Your relationship with money changes because you stop accepting compensation for betraying your values. Your relationship with time shifts because you honor your natural rhythms instead of forcing yourself into artificial schedules. Your relationship with others transforms because you attract people who appreciate authenticity rather than those who require you to diminish yourself for their comfort. Jung also observed that this transformation often activates what he called the wounded healer archetype. Your own journey from accommodation to authenticity gives you deep compassion for others who are still trapped in patterns of compromise. You become a living example that change is possible, that people can reclaim their power, that enough can be said with love rather than anger. Your healing becomes a gift you can offer others, not through preaching or advice giving, but simply through being who you authentically are. The long-term psychological consequences are profound. You develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to govern your own inner world rather than being governed by external circumstances. You stop being reactive and become responsive. You cease being defensive and become discerning. You quit being accommodating and become genuinely generous, giving from fullness rather than emptiness. This transformation also affects your dreams, your creative expression, and your spiritual life. Jung noticed that people who successfully say enough to patterns that diminish them often experience a surge of creative energy. The psychic energy that was trapped in maintaining false positions suddenly becomes available for authentic expression. Artists find their voice. Writers discover their message. Leaders emerge from people who never saw themselves as leaders. Healers awaken in those who have done their own healing work. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to understand that the day you say enough and mean it isn't an ending. It's a beginning. Jung saw it as what he called the birth of the individual, the moment when you stop being a collection of other people's expectations and become an integrated, authentic human being. This birth, like any birth, involves labor, pain, and ultimately, new life. The courage to say enough comes not from anger or rebellion, but from love. Love for your authentic self, love for truth, love for the life you're meant to live, rather than the life you think you should live. Jung understood that this kind of love requires tremendous courage because it means risking disapproval, rejection, and the loss of familiar identities. But he also understood that the alternative, continuing to live a compromised life, eventually becomes unbearable for the awakening psyche. So as you reflect on your own life, on the patterns of accommodation that may have kept you safe but small, on the moments when your soul whispered enough, but your fear said not yet, remember that transformation is not only possible but inevitable for those who choose to honor their deeper truth. The day you finally say enough and mean it will mark the beginning of your real life, the life that's been waiting beneath all the compromise, the life that Jung knew was your birthright as a conscious, individuated human being. Your psyche knows when it's time. Trust that knowing. Trust the process. Trust that you're enough when it comes from authentic alignment rather than reactive anger has the power to transform not only your life, but to contribute to the healing and awakening of our world. The day you say enough and mean it is the day you stop living someone else's life and start living your own. And that, Jung would tell us, is the greatest gift you can offer yourself and the world.